everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk about mobility creep and kind of adjust people's perceptions on this phenomenon. I might have actually done a video on this already. I'll have to go back and check when I'm done recording here. But I do want to kind of talk about it because it's become more and more of a talking point as preseason has gone on. Now, I do want to preface this by saying that I think preseason generally tends to showcase some of these problems a little bit more so than usual. Medler actually talked about it recently in his post, and that a lot of people in preseason stop playing champions that are powerful in organized play or that are generally powerful in coordinated environments because it's preseason. Who cares? We just want to have fun with it, which I think is one of the reasons why the whole marksmen are weak argument has come back up, because people aren't really playing compositions that allow marksmen to thrive. And another issue I think I have with it as well is that people are playing a lot more divers and assassins because it's preseason. I want to play champions that are fun to play, not just champions that are effective. So even though someone like, let's say, Galio or Ornn can be effective, they're not quite as fun to play for a lot of players because they want to be playing the cool, flashy champions that dash around a bunch and do lots of damage and can get a bunch of kills. So I think that's one of the biggest things for me is, I think that partially exacerbates issues, but let's go ahead and say maybe people have a point. Maybe there is such a thing as mobility creep. Is there really, is the question I basically want to ask. Now, if you do look at a lot of Riot's most recent champions, almost all of them have some degree of mobility. I will completely admit that. However, at the same time, I think that it's important to be looking not at champions out of context, but to be asking yourself the question, why does this champion have mobility? And really honestly ask yourself the question. Don't just say, oh, well, they have mobility because Riot wants them to have mobility, or Riot has this whole LCS mindset and they want all their champions to be super flashy and really cool. And I don't think that's necessarily a good question to be asking yourself, because I don't think it tells you realistically why this champion has mobility or why they should. So let's, for example, take a look at Riot's couple of releases this year, starting with Pyke, because he was the most recently released champion. Okay, yes, he's got mobility. He has the dash on Phantom Undertow. Why does he have that dash? Well, instead of just being an arbitrary choice, Pyke has Phantom Undertow. He has the dash on it because he's an assassin first and foremost. That's his whole job. He's supposed to be this cool assassin support champion. Now, assassins generally need some degree of target access. They have to have a way to get on top of these squishies they're supposed to be killing, because that's their job. They are supposed to be killing squishies. So I think it's foolish to say that Pyke should not have mobility when every single other assassin has it. I think it's a valuable trait that assassins actually have. They need to have some way of getting onto the champions they're supposed to be getting. The closest argument you can make for an assassin with no mobility is Rengar, but he does have the dash, which he gets out of his R button as well, and he has some degree of stealth to help him get close to targets. Rengar, I think, is an example of how you could do an assassin without mobility, but I don't think necessarily that having an assassin without mobility is something that Riot should always be striving to do. I think Rengar is interesting from that regard because he doesn't have any degree of mobility outside of the bush dash or the dash on his ultimate. So I think that's more of the exception than the norm. So Pyke needs mobility. Looking at Kai'Sa, for example. Kai'Sa, I think, is interesting. You could definitely make an argument. I would totally agree with you if you said Kai'Sa shouldn't have mobility. However, I would raise the point that generally short-range marksmen have some degree of mobility on their kit. If you look at historic examples such as Vayne and Lucian, who both have something they can do in order to close the gap or kite targets around. Kindred are another good example. They have a very short attack range. If you want even another example, Graves, the shortest range marksman. I would argue he's more of a skirmisher nowadays, but when he came out, he was shorter range and he did have some degree of mobility. So you could justify having it on Kai'Sa, especially given that her ultimate is the only real mobility she has on the kit that I think would count. Obviously, she does have the ability to kind of stealth and avoid enemies with that, and it gives her bonus movement speed, but she can't auto-attack during it, and I think there are reasons you could say that doesn't really count. So I would say at the end of the day that Kai'Sa does have mobility. I wouldn't argue against you if you said, why does she have mobility? But I would say she has it because of these particular reasons. I would also say that she has mobility because it is supposed to be playing up her whole predatory aspect to her. She's supposed to be chasing enemies down from Fog of War and ideally not necessarily assassinating them 100-0, but be able to sort of close the gap on that or use this as an offensive tool. But I wouldn't necessarily give you Kai'Sa as an example. Camille, another champion that people have really been complaining about. She's a diver. Sort of like assassins, divers goals are to get on top of enemy champions and enemy squishies specifically and kill them dead, or at least provide enough of a damage threat that the enemy has to spend time targeting them. They're generally tankier than their assassin counterparts, so they have a better chance to actually survive these situations. So I think that would be another example of why the mobility is warranted, because Camille is a diver. She's supposed to have methods of getting on top of enemy champions. That makes sense. Aurelia is similar. She is a skirmisher instead, so I don't know that it entirely counts, but she does need some degree of mobility. If you look at most of the skirmishers we have in the game, again, examples like Yasuo or Kled, who's really more of a diver, I guess, but Yasuo, Master Yi, Riven, they all have mobility in their kit because skirmishers are essentially entirely dependent on their ability to move around team fights and avoid or negate some damage rather than just straight tanking it. Now, you can make an argument that Aurelia has issues because of how tanky her W makes her just for pressing a button, and I would totally agree with you. I think that's the biggest issue I have with her right now, is that she can press W, gain a ton of resistances, already has really nice health gains. I think that's a problem, theoretically, with Aurelia's kit, but her mobility is fine. So, and you can do this for pretty much any champion that Riot has released, to ask yourself why they have mobility. Very rarely will you come up with a champion where the answer is because Riot wanted them to have mobility. I think that there are a couple of champions where I'm like, why does that champion have a dash? That's unnecessary. But for the most part, if you look at the kind of champions we have in the game, they have it for a reason. And then if you also look at the champions that don't have any degree of mobility, again, the question is why? In some cases, it's because these champions would be really overbearing with it, or because it doesn't fit the kind of champion they are. If I'm supposedly a late game, very long range hyper carry like Kog'Maw, the biggest problem you would have if you gave Kog'Maw mobility is because he's supposed to kill your team from a million miles away. If you get on top of him, and he can easily dash away, well, then he just continues to kill your team, and he's the best champion in the game. Similar thing with Xerath, actually, where he can't have mobility because his whole goal is to kill you from a million miles away. If he had a dash, if he had a way to peel for himself, he'd be really, really too strong. So, while yes, I think Riot have been adding champions with dashes on their kit of late, I wouldn't necessarily say that mobility creep is really a thing. I think that if you look at the champions Riot have been releasing or reworking, the mobility on their kit is almost all warranted. It all has a reason to be there. And even on champions that historically didn't have it and then were reworked, such as Urgot, for example, who had no dash whatsoever besides his ultimate, which generally put him in the middle of the enemy team, which is a terrible spot for him to be back in the day. He now has a dash on him. Why is that? Well, it's a really short range dash. It's a really telegraph dash, and it serves an important feature in allowing him to use his back shotguns in addition to his front shotguns. Otherwise, I think it'd be too hard for Urgot to ever actually use those in fights. So if you look at it from that kind of a lens, you start seeing that a lot of the mobility spells that champions now have in the game have a reason to exist and have a reason to be there, and weren't just kind of slapped onto a kit. I think it's important to be looking at this in context, because sure, if you look at a champion out of context and you just say, why does Aurelia have 8,000 dashes? That it's really easy to say, wow, mobility creep is real. Or if you look at champions that got reworked and say, they didn't have a dash before and now they do, mobility creep is real. But look at their kit, look at what they're intended to do, look at what purpose it serves before you start saying that mobility is completely unwarranted. In fact, and I will mention this as well, Nico, who is coming out soon, I don't believe has any mobility on her kit. She's entirely reliant on using stealth shenanigans and illusion shenanigans to make her opponents suffer. So I think that's an important thing to note here when we're talking about mobility creep, is just take a look at the champion in context. Anyways, that's all just my personal opinion. I know there are a lot of people who really, really dislike all of these champions having dashes and saying it negates champions coming out who don't have any mobility, which I would disagree with, but that's a topic for another video. So if you do disagree with this, go ahead and let me know in the comment section below. I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear what you think of looking at champions in context. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. And if you're looking for more Grab the Lantern content, you can check out my blog, which is linked down in the description. I upload articles just about each and every single day for your enjoyment. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I will talk to you all later.